Se abre la sesión. El señor secretario general leerá el acta de nombramiento como doctor honoris causa a favor del excelentísimo señor don James H. Whitelaw.
Extracto del acta de la sesión de la Junta de Gobierno celebrada el día 23 de noviembre de 1995, donde se acuerda el nombramiento como doctor honoris causa por la Universidad Politécnica de Valencia del excelentísimo señor don James H. Whitelaw. Según consta en el acta correspondiente, en la Junta de Gobierno de la Universidad Politécnica de Valencia, en sesión celebrada el día 23 de noviembre de 1995, presidida por el excelentísimo y magnífico señor rector don Justo Nieto, atendiendo la propuesta de nombramiento como doctor honoris causa a favor de don James H. Whitelaw, informada favorablemente por unanimidad en el Consejo de Investigación de esta universidad, celebrado el 13 de noviembre, a propuesta del Departamento de Máquinas y Motores Térmicos, según expuso ante esta Junta de Gobierno el propio señor rector, y tras diversas intervenciones a favor de la propuesta y a tenor de los méritos que obran en el expediente presentado, se adoptó por unanimidad el acuerdo de nombrar como doctor honoris causa por la Universidad Politécnica de Valencia a don James H. Whitelaw, de lo que yo, Carlos García Gómez, como secretario general de la Universidad Politécnica de Valencia, con el visto bueno del excelentísimo y magnífico señor rector, doy fe, en Valencia, a 11 de junio de 1996.
Don Francisco Pairi González tiene la palabra para presentar al excelentísimo señor don James Whitelaw.
Buenos días. Magnífico y excelentísimo rector amigo. Señoras y señores, doctores y todos mis amigos y compañeros. Quiero comenzar agradeciendo a la universidad el honor que me ha otorgado al permitirme presentar al profesor Whitelaw, al que en el día de hoy investimos como doctor honoris causa por esta universidad. También quiero agradecer a los miembros de la comunidad universitaria el que en su día aceptasen la propuesta del Departamento de Máquinas y Motores Térmicos para nombrar al profesor Whitelaw como doctor honoris causa. Como docente e investigador universitario, ante la responsabilidad que me ha correspondido, he intentado preparar este laudatio como un trabajo más de mi quehacer cotidiano. Tal como le hubiera recomendado a mis alumnos, cuando les tengo que orientar en la elaboración de una tarea, he realizado una revisión bibliográfica, he conocido el estado del arte sobre el tema y lo he estructurado. Pero eso no es todo. He de confesar que me ha resultado muy agradable elaborar el trabajo. Resaltar los méritos y cualidades del profesor Whitelaw no me resulta difícil y además es instructivo, al tiempo que me ha servido para aprender muchas de las cosas necesarias para alcanzar el éxito académico en el complejo mundo universitario. Hablar de los valores humanos de James Whitelaw es fácil. Basta haberle tratado para comprobar su humanidad, su don de gentes, su sentido de humor escocés. Quizás una manera de describir al profesor Whitelaw es referirme a la forma en que nuestro grupo, ya hace más de 10 años, se propuso invitarle para que impartiera un curso sobre la aplicación de técnicas de medida basadas en láser en los motores. He de confesar ahora que no teníamos muchas esperanzas de conseguirlo. ¿Cuál fue nuestra sorpresa cuando al poco tiempo lo tuvimos entre nosotros y mantuvimos, el profesor de Santes y yo mismo, nuestro primer contacto con él? Desde entonces, muchos y muy fructíferos han sido los intercambios, los trabajos, los proyectos en común. Con la generosidad que le caracteriza, nos ha ayudado a abrir muchas puertas en el entramado científico, al que no siempre es fácil acceder cuando uno comienza. Gracias, profesor. Intentando plasmar más y mejor cómo es Jim en su trabajo, le pregunté a su discípulo, y hoy también profesor en el Imperial College, el doctor Arcumanis, que me describiese al profesor Whitelaw. Más o menos reproduzco sus palabras, que creo que lo definen muy bien, y que además pienso que son las cosas y maneras de hacer que un profesor que se dedica a la investigación aplicada debe poseer para el éxito en el trabajo. Sus palabras eran: Jim, como investigador, tiene la rara habilidad de intuir las posibilidades de éxito de la aplicación de una técnica concreta a la resolución de un problema de ingeniería. Es capaz de discernir entre lo que es y no es razonable, y tiene gran sentido de la oportunidad. Sus estimaciones sobre el tiempo necesario para llevar a cabo un trabajo de investigación son siempre muy precisas. Tiene una mentalidad muy inquisitiva y no es fácil de contentar, pues coloca el listón muy alto para sí mismo, sus colaboradores y sus compañeros. Trabaja mucho y tiene unas excelentes cualidades como director, lo que es de destacar en un académico. Otra cualidad importante que tiene es que apoya a sus colaboradores y está siempre dispuesto a ayudar en las situaciones difíciles. Al mismo tiempo, se manifiesta distante con las personas que no le gustan y con aquellos que no tienen rigurosidad en su trabajo. Whitelaw está casado con Elspeth y tiene 3 hijos. Los 3 doctores, por casualidad. También tiene 3 nietos que yo creo que todavía no son doctores, seguramente debido a su edad. Enhorabuena a la familia. Estoy seguro de que mucho de lo que es Jill se lo debe a ella. Antes de hablar de los méritos científicos del profesor Whitelaw, me parece importante hacer una pequeña reflexión sobre el centro donde desarrolla su labor docente e investigadora, el Imperial College. Por las lecciones que podemos obtener en provecho de nuestra institución, es decir, de nuestros profesores y alumnos. De la organización del Imperial College se pueden resaltar los siguientes aspectos. La vida académica es fácil por las ayudas de todo tipo que existen: laboratorios, bibliotecas, centros de cálculo, residencias, etc. La estructura organizativa es simple y está basada en los departamentos con un importante apoyo administrativo. Y finalmente, las relaciones con la industria y los estamentos oficiales es intensa y muy fructífera. Todo ello conduce a que haya habido 46 miembros de la Royal Society, 36 miembros de la Royal Academy of Engineering y 3 premios Nobel. Un dato más, el 32% de los estudiantes de esa universidad están realizando el doctorado. Quiero resaltar la organización y los fines del Departamento de Ingeniería Mecánica, en el que, tal como se entiende en el ámbito anglosajón, la mecánica es no solo la mecánica del sólido, sino sobre todo la mecánica de fluidos. Y la mecánica de fluidos no es solo la de fluidos incompresibles, sino sobre todo la mecánica de los fluidos compresibles, sección que dirige el profesor Whitelaw. Estoy convencido que los éxitos en los trabajos sobre transferencia de masa y energía, tan importantes para fenómenos como la combustión o retos como la contaminación atmosférica, se alcanzarán mejor y más rápidamente con este concepto anglosajón de la ingeniería mecánica. Paso a la segunda parte del laudatio, en donde quiero resaltar los méritos del profesor Whitelaw. Comenzó su trabajo científico y postdoctoral en el área de la termodinámica general bajo la dirección del profesor Kestin de la Universidad de Brown en Estados Unidos. Sus trabajos estuvieron relacionados con la determinación de viscosidades de gases. A partir de los años 60, su interés se dirige a la mecánica de fluidos y la transmisión de calor. Y a principios de los 70 comienza sus trabajos relacionados con la caracterización teórica y experimental de los procesos de combustión. Es uno de los pioneros en la utilización de técnicas de medida avanzadas, basadas en láser. Y así, en los años 70, comenzó a realizar experimentos con velocimetría láser Doppler. Y a mediados de los 80 utiliza la técnica de velocimetría fase Doppler para la determinación simultánea de la velocidad y el tamaño de las gotas en estudios de atomización en chorros líquidos. A lo largo de su carrera ha realizado importantes contribuciones al mejor conocimiento de los distintos aspectos de los procesos de transferencia de masa, cantidad de movimiento y calor. Pero tal vez su mayor contribución a la ciencia haya sido el desarrollo y aplicación de técnicas de medida, tanto convencionales como basadas en láser, a un amplio espectro de problemas de gran interés industrial y científico, entre los que se encuentran quemadores, turbinas de gas, motores de encendido provocado y motores diésel. Ha trabajado en problemas de laboratorio, pero también junto a la industria, tanto en Europa como en Estados Unidos y en Japón, ayudando a la resolución de sus problemas. Como ejemplos de esta labor, sus actividades como consultor en la industria aeronáutica McDonnell Douglas, Knight Technology, NASA, o en la industria del automóvil, Ford, Honda, Peugeot, etc. Como resumen de sus méritos, ahí están sus más de 250 artículos, sus 27 libros, su participación en numerosas revistas científicas como editor, y resaltar finalmente su reciente nombramiento como miembro de la Royal Society, que es el más alto galardón que se puede otorgar a un científico en el Reino Unido. Para terminar, yo entiendo que no lo comprenderá, no quiero dejar en el olvido nuestras apasionadas discusiones sobre chorros, en particular chorros turbulentos con un contorno muy abierto. Muchas gracias.
Se va a proceder a la solemne investidura como doctor del excelentísimo señor don James H. Whitelaw.
Todos en pie, por favor.
Por la Junta de Gobierno de la Universidad Politécnica de Valencia, a propuesta del Rectorado y en testimonio de reconocimiento de vuestros relevantes méritos, habéis sido nombrado doctor honoris causa. En virtud de la autoridad que me está conferida, os entrego dicho título y os impongo como símbolo el birrete laureado, venerado distintivo del Alto Magisterio Español. Llevadlo sobre vuestra cabeza como la corona de vuestros estudios y merecimientos. Recibid el anillo que la antigüedad entregaba en esta venerada ceremonia como emblema del privilegio de firmar y sellar los dictámenes, consultas y censuras de vuestra ciencia y profesión, así como los guantes blancos, símbolo de la pureza que deben conservar vuestras manos, unos y otros, signos también de la distinción de vuestra categoría. Porque os habéis incorporado a este claustro, recibid ahora en su nombre, don James Whitelaw, el abrazo de fraternidad de los que se honran y congratulan de ser vuestros hermanos y compañeros. Sentados, por favor. Tiene la palabra el excelentísimo señor don James Whitelaw.
Rector, delegates of the Government, Educational Minister of Valencia, representatives of local authorities, members of the governing body, professors of the university, visitors, friends, and wife. I must begin with thanks, and there are many words of thanks to say. First to the university for conveying this honour. It's a privilege, it's always a pleasure to be here. It's a special privilege on this occasion, and I am most grateful. To the Rector for conferring the degree, thank you very much indeed. To Professor Francisco Pairi for his citation, most of which I had read in advance and could almost believe. Marco, thank you very much indeed. I wouldn't be here if it were not for him, since it was he who invited me in the first place to come to Valencia, it seems like many years ago. To Professor Pepe de Santis, who began the work of the local arrangements and looks wonderful in that hat. To Professor Ernesto de los Reyes, who did almost all of the administration in the latter stages and did it impeccably well, not one hitch. Thank you very much indeed. To these three in particular for their friendship over a long period of time, may it continue for much longer. To colleagues, to students, to previous students, to all of whom I owe a debt and would not be here had they not made their contributions, I would like to say thank you. And to my many friends in Valencia today, hopefully in the future, thank you very much indeed. And now I have to make an address, I hope. And I had to choose a subject which I thought would be easy to convey to everyone, but also interest my friends in the laboratory in Valencia. So I chose the subject of transportation and exhaust emissions. I have one other constraint, and that is that no one can smoke in this room, and so I'm obliged to be quick. So here's my title, Transportation and Exhaust Emissions. And I prepared a number of slides, and I've only used some of them. I think I have 24 slides in all. I want to make some introductory remarks about politics, about science, about engineering, and about sales. And there are 6 panels on this topic, so they're easy to understand. And then I will take 2 panels to say something about regulations. And why do I choose regulations as the first topic after the introduction? I do so because the work which we conduct in universities, at least at the moment, is controlled by the requirements of people who make regulations for transportation. And I'm very grateful to them because they have set rules which are difficult to follow, and we have to spend money in order to try to understand and to improve the situation so as to meet their regulations. And I will mention only, I think, in this talk, some of the regulations in Europe and some in the United States, particularly in California. And then I will go on to talk about gasoline engines and diesel engines, and you will note that I do not say anything about gas turbine engines for transportation, and the reason for this will become clear on the next slide. So when I come to the end, I will make some quick conclusions, but perhaps I can state the most important conclusion at the beginning, and it is that without better knowledge than we have today, we will not be able to meet the regulations which are proposed for the year 2000, so that more work is necessary, and it is more work of the type which involves understanding. The origins of regulations, the first of my introductory remarks. Regulations are formulated and imposed by individuals. These individuals come together in committees. The committees have representatives of companies, governments intervene, and private and public agencies are also there trying to make their statements. So that regulations are things which, to some degree, we can all influence, but it is difficult to influence them as an individual. The motivations of people who are on these committees are various. Most of them have goodwill, the good of the people at heart, but it's the people from the local region in many occasions. Sometimes it's the people representing a state or a province, and sometimes it's people representing a national government, or in the case of Europe, the European Union. These people are in some ways responsible to politicians. The politicians, even though they are wonderful politicians, usually seek re-election. So each of these individuals, each of these committees, each of these companies, each of these governments and the politicians behind them have an axe to grind. And the grinding of the axes can often be heard for very, very, very long distances. So we should be careful with regulations. They are not cast in concrete. They are likely to change. If you consider the contrast between the needs for efficient use of fuel, for transportation, for clean air, and for low cost, and then think of the requirements of somebody who drives a truck and makes money from doing so, from somebody who sits on a beach and wishes it to be clean, for someone who sells gasoline or diesel fuel, or for someone who wishes to get from A to B in his Ferrari very quickly, these requirements are all different, and they are in some contrast. He who wishes to have clean air may drive his Ferrari, but he has to have a catalyzer in order to keep it relatively clean, and he probably would rather not have it. There are many conflicts in the groups of people who are in this body of individuals, this body of committees, this body of countries who wish to have an economic system and at the same time to have one which is free of pollution emissions. The nub of the matter is probably the last one, which says that most people would like to do things at low cost, and low cost is not easy to achieve. Geographical effects, inversion layers, city driving and freeways. Much of the pollution regulations for vehicles today, for cars and for trucks, is prompted by what happens in a few places where they have geographical effects. They're subject to inversion layers, they have some sunshine, the inversion layers tend to trap the emissions. The emissions are breathed by people. You can see them if they're NOx, and this causes problems. You can also see them if they're particulates, and this causes problems too. So that if you live, for instance, in Los Angeles or Denver or Athens, you have particular requirements which mean that you would like to clean up the air in these particular towns, because if you don't, the inversion layers will keep the pollutants in the vicinity and you will breathe them. And the last point in that slide is about total energy. I will come later in this talk to a few words about electric vehicles. And electric vehicles cost money. And because the electric vehicle moves along for 100 kilometers at a particular speed with a particular usage of electricity, does not represent the total energy cost of the electric vehicle. It had to be designed, it had to be built. The manufacturing costs, at least in the first instance, are rather large. And so if you're going to talk about energy conservation should include manufacturing costs and the power levels, the generators which are required to provide the electricity which drive the electric vehicle. So it's a complex business. Let me take a few minutes to look at sources of pollution. And I hope you'll forgive me for presenting a slide which comes from pollution in the United Kingdom, but I think it's fairly representative of most countries, at least in Europe. And I've highlighted on this slide with pie diagrams the emissions of nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, and carbon monoxide. And I do so because they're probably the ones which are most prevalent in our minds, with the single exception of particulates, to which I will come later in connection with diesel engines. And if you glance for a moment at each of these slides, you will see that road transport is responsible for a lot of the emissions of nitrous oxide. It is also clear that power stations are responsible for just as much. There is nothing on this slide to represent airplane gas turbines, which is why I didn't want to talk very much about it in the context of the title of this talk. The airplane gas turbines generate NOx. They also generate CO and CO2 and some unburned hydrocarbon, but as a total global quantity, it's small compared to what happens because of power stations and road transport. If I look at sulfur dioxide emissions, about which I will say very little, there is an enormous problem, and it still exists in connection with power stations. There's a rapid trend to move away from sulfur-burning coal, sulfur-burning solid fuels, and an even more rapid trend to move away from solid fuels to gaseous fuels. But that will change again in the future, perhaps not in the next 10 years, but thereafter it will. And we'll be back worrying about how to clean out sulfur dioxide, which is a very nasty substance indeed, since with a little water it forms an acid, and the acid has harmful effects on just about everything. Here I have carbon monoxide emissions, and carbon monoxide emissions are particularly important. They are toxic, they're plentiful. From power stations the quantity is very large, but from road transport the quantity is remarkably small. So in terms of road transport, we can see that we should worry about NOx emissions, and on this slide at least not very much about carbon monoxide. And if we're sufficiently efficient, then we won't have unburned hydrocarbons. Perhaps I could say that these emissions in power stations may change in the United Kingdom when we start to burn cows. But perhaps it would be better if we burnt the politicians, but the pollutants then might be even worse. A few words about politics, and I can take them in any order. The top quotation comes from the Los Angeles Times, and it indicates the pressures which large companies can bring to bear on regulations imposed by other people. The second one says that when you buy a car today, you buy a car with a catalyst, and you're happy to have the catalyst except when you stop the car because it smells, but you're not happy to pay for it. On the other hand, the manufacturer is quite happy. The man who provides the platinum from Johnson Matthey is extremely happy, and people like Daimler-Benz or BMW or Fiat are quite happy to make catalysts and make a profit from them in the knowledge that you have to buy them in order to meet the pollution regulations. Reformulated fuels, oxygenated diesel fuels, will we afford that? Well, reformulated fuels, reformulated gasoline improves the emissions, it reduces the amount of unburned hydrocarbon, it reduces the NOx, and it is now you buy it, whether you like it or not, when you go to a petrol pump, to a gasoline pump in the United States, and you don't even notice the increase in cost, even though it was about 7 or 8 cents a gallon. If it's more expensive to use oxygenated diesel fuels, but they too would improve things if we were prepared to pay for them. So there is a question here as to whether we will, in the future, spend more money by putting in better fuels into our cars or trucks. Here's another line. Cars are not made in California, nor is the power to make them. They don't make cars in California. The power supply for an electric vehicle doesn't come from California either. Much of it comes from Idaho and other places and is transported into the state. And yet the state of California has been responsible for much of the emission regulation which we're trying to meet today. It's a very local problem, a local group of people effectively imposing regulations on the rest of us for reasons which suit them. If I think about pollution, there is almost no pollution in Portugal or in England because it's exported. It's something we export free. There's a southwest wind and it transports it to other places. There is no longer any pollution in Scotland because there is no industry. The Industrial Revolution has disappeared and we don't have heavy industry there anymore, so we don't have much in the way of pollution. So some people care more about pollution than others. I'm sure that if you live in Düsseldorf and you collect the pollution that came from a power station in the middle of England, you get it the next day, but you're not very happy to receive it. So it is a good idea for this reason, if this reason alone, to have a European Union so that we can make people in one country improve their act so as to make that in another country more easy to live. Greece is a very special problem. Greece has a big inversion difficulty, and they impose interesting regulations. They impose a regulation which says you can only take your car into Athens if the number plate has an even number on day 1 and an odd number on day 2. And the solution to this problem is not to own one Mercedes, but to own 2. So pollution regulations, local ones, have interesting effects. And now we have Greeks with 2 Mercedes quite frequently. Which would you rather have? When you leave here today, would you rather have a gasoline-driven car or a diesel-driven car? We know that diesel fuel is cheaper than gasoline. Even the oxygenated versions may well be cheaper. We know that diesel engines are more efficient. We know that diesel engines provide less pollution per kilogram of fuel burned, although the pollutants may be a little bit different. We also know that the diesel engine is heavier, that the acceleration is not quite so good, that the comfort factor within the car may not be quite so good. So why do we not all drive diesel engine automobiles? Well, you might ask the man with the Ferrari why he does not have a diesel engine in his Ferrari, and that will give you the answer. But we don't all want to drive diesel engines, even though they are becoming much more prevalent in France, in Spain, and in Italy. This is a slide which relates to gasoline engines, and it's a technical slide, but it's easy to understand. If you burn your fuel and air in the engine with a mixture which has this ratio, 15:1 air to fuel, then you get a lot of NO, a lot of NOx, and you get a little, a lesser quantity of, you get some unburnt hydrocarbon and you get some CO. But if you were to burn in your car with an air-fuel ratio of 20, then the NOx level goes down, the unburnt hydrocarbon has gone down very slightly, and the CO level has gone down quite a bit. So then you ask the question, why do we not drive cars with lean burn engines? And there are two answers. One of them is that you can't drive with lean burn configuration all of the time because you want to drive quickly. So you need more fuel, and then quite often you're driving in this range here. That's one reason, although one has to say that for more than half the time you could well be driving in this region here with low NOx. So one reason why people do not drive with lean burn engines is because it's only for part of the cycle that you can use the lean burn. The bigger reason is that there has been an emphasis over many years in Europe and in the United States to drive everything with a catalyst. So you operate with this air-fuel ratio and the catalyst will work. The catalyst burns out the extra unburnt hydrocarbon and converts the NOx into nitrogen and water. So the catalyst, in a sense, has begun to drive the industry as opposed to knowledge and best things for the individual. How do we reduce emissions? There are two basic ways. One of them is to operate the engine with combustion, which is controlled in a way so that the emissions will be at their smallest, and that might suggest that you would go to the burning of lean mixtures. In diesel engines, in the last 2 years, 3 years perhaps, there has been almost a revolution with the advent of very high pressure sprays, computer controlled, and squirting into each cylinder one at a time. And that's making a big difference to diesel engines today. But it still involves here a control of what happens inside the cylinder. And the real question is, to what extent can we modify the combustion process to reduce emissions to meet the aspirations of the regulators? And that's why many of us are in the business of combustion today. The alternative is to allow the engine to behave any way it likes, or perhaps in a particular controlled way, and to have something at the back end. So in the gasoline car, you have the catalyst. In the diesel car, you also have a sort of catalyst, but you may have to have a bucket to pick up the particulates so that they are not deposited into the street or into your lungs. So catalysts are something which you do after the event. Things which capture particulates are things which you do after the event, and there is no doubt in my mind that we would do better to concentrate on these aspects, even though the catalyst and the separation of particles may be necessary in the immediate future. The question at the end is one I'm going to try to answer: how much do we really know, and what can we do to find out? A few words, and only a few words, about regulations. If you go back to 1992, the European Union imposed regulations on carbon monoxide, on the combination of unburnt hydrocarbon and nitrous oxide, and for diesel engines and particulates. And the EEC also said, we will give the diesel engine, direct injection diesel engine, a break because we know that more development work is necessary. But we also know that we also believe that there's a high probability that the DI diesel engine will prove to be better than the IDI system, and that's why we all work on it today. So the regulations are posed in this way, and you can see that the quantity of carbon monoxide which was allowed in 1992 was reduced in 1996, and if I put in the stage 3 regulations for year 2000, these quantities would come down even further. The emissions are still formulated, the regulations are still formulated in the same way, but this may well change, because if I look at the way in which Californian standards are imposed, they're different. They don't combine unburnt hydrocarbon with nitrous oxide. They separate the different aspects of the hydrocarbons in these two tables there. They separately have CO and they separately have NOx. But they have one bigger difference, and the bigger difference is that they say, we will categorize our vehicles according to a particular code. And the code is indicated there in these little letters. They say, We have today got transitional low-emission vehicles. We have today got low-emission vehicles, and tomorrow we will have ultra-low emission vehicles, and ultimately we will have zero-emission vehicles. Now, if you look at the regulations which are about to be imposed, and I believe they will be, they will say that in the year 2003, 10% of all vehicles on the road have to have zero emissions. Today, they say that in 2 years' time, in 1998, 2% of the vehicles on the road have to have zero emissions. In a way, this is a strange decision, because zero-emission vehicles, there's no such thing. There's always an emission. It may have come from the power plant which provided the electricity to drive the car, but the emission is still there. So we should be careful with these regulations. And that's all I'm going to say about the regulations. And I want to switch and say something about gasoline engines, and then say something about diesel engines. And here's something about gasoline engines. And I start and I end with the catalyst. But I have the belief that the catalyst is like a tail wagging a dog. It's the way it appears to me in the way we work with engines just now. The present three-way catalysts will only operate if the air-fuel ratio in the engine is within this range. You have to have it within this range. You have to have some excess unburned hydrocarbon coming into the catalyst to light it. And if you do that, then you'll get 80% conversion of NOx, HC, and CO into effectively water, nitrogen, and nitrogen and CO2. That number, 80% efficiency over that range, means that you're talking about a new catalyst. One that hasn't been used, it's about to work, and it will work like that for a period of time which is not well quantified. We don't know very much about the longevity of catalysts. We just know that they get worse. Which is one reason why we have some control in countries to try and regulate the car. They're tested after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, depending on where you are. But the tests are not very sophisticated, so in all probability, catalysts decay more rapidly than we think, and together with the catalyst, the emission performance. So that's why we have this tendency to work in Europe, and certainly in the United States, with engines which have a stoichiometric air-fuel ratio. That means in that range, and we do not use lean burn. In some ways, I question the wisdom of this decision, but I think it will change as time goes on. I should also say that if you look at the split between what happens in Japan and what happens in Europe and the United States, in Japan, they make engines which will operate with lean burn. In Europe and the United States, we make engines which will operate with stoichiometric air-fuel ratios and with some exhaust gas recirculation. And exhaust gas recirculation will never be as effective as will lean burn, but it's a convenient way to operate to guarantee that you get the emission regulations satisfied, provided you have the stoichiometric ratio and a catalyst which is working properly. Well, how can we control the combustion, which is what we'd like to do? And we have only well, that's not the right way. We have two main ways of doing it. One is to control the flow characteristics in the combustion chamber, and the other one is to control the fuel, the way the fuel is added to the combustion chamber. And that's true for both gasoline engines and for diesel engines. What do we want? Well, we want to have an engine which, when you climb into it, you put your foot on the accelerator and it takes off. It doesn't make vibrations. It runs reasonably economically, and it will accelerate past the person that you don't like in the car in front of you. I can translate this into flame kernels. This is a little flame which is formed when the spark takes place, which will move away from the electrode, that's the spark plug, and advance to consume all of the fuel within low remaining concentrations of unburnt hydrocarbon, and yet leave enough unburnt hydrocarbon to light the catalyst, which is down the pipe and underneath your feet. Lean mixtures, which give rise to very low NOx, or can give rise to very low NOx, may have some problems in other respects because they may produce higher concentrations of unburnt hydrocarbon, but that too can be overcome. We want to make sure that we have low cycle variability, and that translates into drivability. When you accelerate the car, when you put your foot on the accelerator, the car should accelerate smoothly. And at the bottom line, I haven't put it here, we should always want to have a car which is efficient with good fuel consumption. And how do we get these things? Well, we measure, we calculate, and we think. And if I can then plug in 3 or 4 slides what it is that we do when we measure, we build special purpose engines like this thing here, where you can get optical access and you can see what happens inside the combustion chamber. And then you develop techniques like the ones written here, laser Doppler velocimetry, phase Doppler velocimetry, fluorescence, and so on. Very complicated techniques which many of my colleagues in the audience today have participated in and indeed been leaders in the development of, so that today we can make measurements inside these engines where yesterday we could not. These instrumentation developments are essential to what we do today. If they had not been made in the past few years, we would not do very well at developing what happens inside the combustion chamber of an engine. I can say the same thing for calculation methods, that you have to have a lot of background work in order to develop a calculation method which will allow you to usefully predict what you might get inside an engine. This is a messy slide, but there are only a couple of things that I want to say, and they're easy for me to say. This is a slide which says that if you change the velocity characteristics within an engine, then you can change some things which matter. And let me just pick 2. These are, well, 3 maybe. These are flame kernel growths inside an engine when you change from a flow which is almost not there, pretty well quiescent, to a flow which is there. And this lot of flame kernels are a little bit bigger than those which you see here. But this slide here shows that for any given equivalence ratio on this axis here, the mean effective pressure is very much increased. That's this curve here. When I have flow inside the combustion chamber. So in this slide, I've arranged a flow inside the engine, and I get a much better mean effective pressure. You're looking at numbers, I can barely read them, but about 30% better in this particular case at an equivalence ratio of something like 0.9. At the same time, this slide shows drivability, the covariance of the pressure fluctuations, and the corresponding curve to that one there is the bottom one there, which says that the car is much easier to drive. So by making the flow, by producing a flow inside the engine, you make it more powerful and you make it more drivable for the same amount of fuel. How do you arrange that? Well, you do it by changing the port and the valve and the shape of the combustion chamber. And about this, we know a lot. The second thing which you can do is on this slide, and I will take it in 2 stages. This is a slide which shows the variation of mean effective pressure in an engine as a function of the equivalence ratio or the inverse of the air-fuel ratio. So if I'm stoichiometric, that's what when most cars run, I'm up here. If I'm lean burn, I'm down here. And if I introduce into this flow a small jet, a turbulent jet, which is aimed at the spark plug, a very small one with a very little amount of air, then I can get a benefit. I can change the mean effective pressure, for instance, here at the air-fuel ratio, the equivalence ratio of 0.7. I can change it, I can improve it by 55%, just by that small jet aimed at the spark plug at the right time. And if I take that jet and I don't make the jet the same as the fuel and air inside the cylinder, but I make it rich, a little more fuel this time, then the flame kernel develops better. So with a better mixture distribution, I can benefit not 55%, but something closer to 70%. And even better, this engine, and it's not a very good engine, will run very well at air-fuel ratio something less than 0.5 with that added jet of fuel and air, fairly rich fuel and air, at the spark gap. Now I put that slide in partly because I wanted to say a few words about something called direct injection, because you have different ways in which you can put the fuel into this engine. What I've drawn here is one where about 95% of the fuel goes in with air through the port. and the rest goes in through this little jet. But you can turn that around, and you can put all of the fuel and all of the air in as a jet, and you get a direct injection gasoline engine. There is nothing new about gasoline engines which have direct injection. Mercedes had them in 1952, I think, although I was too young to notice. More recently, they have them in one engine coming from Japan, the Mitsubishi engine, where they have direct fuel injection in that car, and they tell us that the performance is wonderful, but we don't know yet. So there is a range of ways of injecting fuel and air into the engine, and I've tried to dwell on three. One where you have only the fuel coming, you have the fuel coming only through the port. One where you have some of the fuel coming through a small jet, and a third one, which I have not shown, where the fuel comes entirely through a small jet and aimed usually at the piston in order to atomize further before it is burned. It is not clear which of these is going to be best. That's something that remains to be proven. But they do give you a degree of flexibility in improving the performance, the emission performance of vehicles of today. I put this complicated slide up because I want to emphasize something that comes from Japan. It is not that I have fallen in love with Japan, it's that I think they do some things, sometimes, a little better than we do. This diagram shows two curves. And one of them corresponds to a 4-valve engine, 2 inlet valves. The inlet valves go up and down like this, in phase. And the other one shows the same engine where the 2 valves do not go up and down like this. They go up and, I can't do it. One goes up and down like this, and the other one just goes like that, just a little bit. And because that changes the flow pattern inside the engine, which is port fueled, the drivability in the engine is much better. If you climb into a car with a covariance which is better than bigger than about 7%, you will complain. If it's less than 7%, you'll be very happy. This engine will run to only an equivalence ratio of something like 18 before the covariance, before the drivability is very bad. But this engine here, which is the same engine with a different valve movement, will go to an air-fuel ratio of 24. Now, every car that I know in Europe today and in America operates like this and not like this. There must be a lesson there for us. And I can also say, if I look at this diagram here, that the NOx concentrations out here, this is with the lean burn situation, have gone down to a small fraction of what they were there. So perhaps we have something to learn from our Japanese friends. Let me stop the talk about gasoline engines with 2 quick slides. One of them is to say that we know a lot about gasoline engines. We want to get rid of the unburnt hydrocarbons, except for the small amount which we need in the catalyst, and we know where they come from, and we know how to get rid of them. It isn't easy, but we know how to do it. And then the last one comes back to my catalyst again. The one approach to the problem of catalysts is to say, I will develop a catalyst which will operate with lean mixtures, so that then I can sell my catalyst as well as have my lean burn engine. The levels of NOx which you get from a truly lean burn engine are only slightly higher than those from present day regulations. But that small difference has imposed a very big effort on the industry in order to make new catalysts which will operate with these lean mixtures, in order again to convert the carbon monoxide, the hydrocarbon, and the NOx into CO2, H2, and nitrogen. And this may be a disproportionate effort, but it's an effort which is going on and which will, in the end, improve emission situations. Now I have a few slides on diesel engines which say some of the same things. Diesel engines are awful. Diesel engines are smelly, heavy, not responsive, things which we see very often. And I say that because you don't want to drive them most of the time, some of you do, but when you want to drive them, you want them to have performance the same as that of gasoline engines, and it's hard to do. I also say it because it seems today that every time I drive behind a truck, that something must be wrong, because when he changes gear, usually automatically, I get a slug of soot coming into, or particles coming into my intake system in the car, and I can smell it from some distance down the road. Why not remove the nasty emissions by afterburning? Well, it's much more difficult to do in the diesel engine because the combustion process is largely a diffusion combustion process with excess oxygen, so you can't use the same type of catalyst. Secondly, the generation of particulates inside the diesel engine is different. And although the particulates may be small, they're of a particular chemical composition and stratification which makes them difficult to burn out. They can be burned out, but they're difficult to get rid of, which is why today and for some years to come, I'm sure that we will have traps at the back end of diesel engines trying to get rid of the particulates before they fall into the atmosphere. Two-way oxidation catalysts are used today, although very recently, and three-way catalysts for low NOx, the same as for the gasoline engines, are under development just now. Traps are under development together with catalytic combustion and an afterburner. I love that phrase. An afterburner, and the collection of particulates is also something which is proposed. But just as with the gasoline engine, that is not the solution. The solution is really to try to understand and to improve what happens inside the combustion chamber. We have the same situation that we have in the gasoline engine, but a little bit more slowly. We have 2-valve and 4-valve heads. We can manipulate what happens to the valves. We can manipulate the shape of the intake port. We can take the direct injection spray and we can phase it in different ways and locate it in different positions. There is a great deal of work which can be done, and big steps have already been taken, because today we are able to inject with very high pressures and therefore to atomize the fuel into very small droplets and therefore evaporate it much more quickly. And you can see the degree of success which has been achieved in this slide. This is a little chart which says, here you've got particulate emissions, here you've got hydrocarbon and NOx emissions on these two axes, and the trend is coming down here. You look at the regulations, stage 1, 1992, 1994, stage 2, 1996, and the proposed stage 3 for 2000, you can see the trend. Now, we haven't achieved this. Indeed, we haven't really achieved this, but we're getting very close. Previously, we had these levels in this region here, 1990, that's past history. Around about, well, when this thing here is drawn, around about this period here, we started to use, in 1994 really, we started to use high pressure injection systems which are computer controlled with fuel squirting separately and controlled at each cylinder, and that got things better very quickly. And then we started to use, not started, but we started to understand what we were doing by using a certain amount of exhaust gas recirculation, and that cut down the unburned hydrocarbon and decreased the NOx as well, so they both went down in this axis. And then we got rid of some of the particulates by putting in an oxidation catalyst at the back end of the diesel engine. But you will find today that not all diesel engines have this. And then going ahead a little bit, the 4-valve engines, which are now common in gasoline engines, are coming in diesel engines to give us more control, the possibility of more control of the combustion, and with higher levels of exhaust gas recirculation, we expect to get down here. And then if you stick an oxidation catalyst in the back end of that, we hope to get down to this thing here. Much of that is hope. Much of it depends, perhaps all of it depends, on work which will be done by people like Professor Payri and his group here in Valencia, who are leaders in this subject in Spain and throughout the world. It's a very important topic, and if you drive behind the same truck as I did, then you will have the same desire to make it clean up attack. Just one technical slide on diesel engines, just the one. What you see here is a picture taken from underneath the cylinder head of a 2-valve diesel engine. And if I look across here, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sprays. These are fuel sprays coming into the engine through the injector. Now they started here, and you can see that a little piece of fuel came out here, and a trail of it here, and a little piece of fuel came out there. And then you jump a distance of what is only 0.3 milliseconds to this one when the sprays are not quite fully developed, but a lot of them is developed, and you see a little white flash. So over that 0.3 milliseconds, these sprays come into the engine, and here you get spontaneous ignition at this point. You cannot predict where that spontaneous ignition will occur, and you know that it will not stay there forever. That spontaneous ignition will then begin close to the liner out here, and then the flow and the flame will be swept around in this direction. We have to develop better control of these processes within the engine. If you look even very quickly, you can see that the sprays are not equal. It is not as well controlled as it should be, and that is a very modern German diesel engine. Only 2 more slides, and then I will stop. After treatment is probably essential in the diesel engine in the short term, as it is in the gasoline engine, probably more so in the diesel engine. If you do use filters, they have to be cleaned. It's a nuisance. If you collect the particles, you have to dispose of them. So there's a lot of talk about active and passive regeneration, which really means that you're going to have a little burner sitting under your feet in the diesel engine in order to burn out the particulates. Cyclones can improve the agglomeration of particles and therefore make them easier to separate by further centrifuging. Again, the particulates have to be removed, and there is still some uncertainty as to the extent to which we can gain further benefits from exhaust gas recirculation. And in my last slide, in the knowledge that 1 or 2 of my students are not going to survive unless they have a cigarette in the very near future, zero emissions, there is no such thing. So that when California introduces regulations saying that we must have zero emission vehicles, they're kidding themselves. It may be low emissions in the immediate vicinity of the car, of the electric car, which they're talking about, but you had to plug it in, and a power station had to provide the energy, and somebody had to spend the money and the effort to make that vehicle in the first place. So we need total energy considerations and not just local ones. Electric vehicles and hybrids, well, I'm sure they will come, but I think they will be very slow, in both senses of the word. Modified fuels for gasoline and diesel engines, I'm sure that we will find them imposed upon us in the not too distant future. It's not a question of choice. Governments will impose better gasoline, reformulated gasolines, and oxygenated diesel fuel. Treatment of exhaust will continue. It's something which will go on for a long time until we know enough. Until we know enough in order to overcome the problem from inside the cylinder, which is where most of us would prefer to work now, tomorrow, and probably the next day. And if you ask some further questions about alternative fuels, don't ask the question about hydrogen engines. They might be low in pollution, but they're high in danger, and I don't believe they will happen. Don't ask the question about vegetable oils, because although they're fine, there are in some respects lots of problems in others. And if 3 blobs is a sign of what we don't like, and this is not my slide, you can see 3 sets of 3 blobs for electricity as something which is not likely to happen quickly. On the other hand, if you look at liquid gas done properly, it offers high possibilities for the future. Rector, gentlemen, ladies, thank you very much for your attention.